All right. So tonight's program outline is on this slide here. What we're going to talk about is tree anatomy, first, tree selection, and the time of year to tap. We'll go through tools and equipment, both with tapping and with processing. So you'll kind of know what you need to purchase. We're going to talk a lot about tapping, collection, the filtration process, and we will go into processing your sap into syrup. And then finally, we're going to end with questions from you all that that can kind of help answer anything that you might still be unclear about. We'll go to the next slide, Angie. All right, so most people, when they think about tapping trees for syrup, we think of the Northeast part of the United States, Vermont, New Hampshire, where there's a lot of maple trees. And yes, maple trees are probably the best trees or the primary trees that get tapped, especially for the syrup that we buy in the stores. But there are 27 different kinds of trees that you can tap to collect the sap to process into syrup. And this comes from that website that's there on this slide. So on the right-hand side there, you've got all the trees that are in the maple family. That includes sugar maples, silver maples, box elders. So any type of maple. But then from there, there's birch trees that you can tap. You can tap walnut trees. So Missouri is well known for black walnut trees. That is a very, very good tree to tap. We'll talk about it a little bit more later. Sycamores, hickory is on there. The hickory tree, you actually don't tap it so much to collect the sap in a normal way as those other trees. You're going to actually use the bark of the hickory tree to create the syrup. So I'm not going to go into that a lot tonight on that particular tree, but it is used a little bit differently from the others. So the great thing about these trees, a lot of these 27 trees are found in common backyards in the city. So you don't have to have a large amount of property to get started tapping trees and collecting the sap. We're going to stay on this slide because there's a few things that if you're going to start or you want to tap trees for the sap to make it into syrup, you really need to start in the summer and fall. That is when you want to go out, you want to identify and mark the trees that you expect to tap during the winter. My words on there are incorrect because you're going to be tapping in the winter time. Stick with deciduous trees. So that's going to be trees that lose their leaves in the winter. Ensure the tree you will tap is healthy and adequate size. And then make sure that if you're going to experiment with tapping a new tree species, make sure it is not a toxic tree or a threatened species. So those are a couple of things to really keep in mind, because there are some trees that you do not want to collect the sap from. A pine tree is a perfect example. That is not, they produce sap, but that's not sap that's going to be good for us. So as we go to the next slide, this first portion of the program tonight is going to deal with tree identification. So in this picture here, this is a fall photo of a sugar maple tree. So sugar maple trees are easy to identify in the fall. They're kind of that orange and yellow colors in their leaves. So it's a pretty easy one to identify. If you have that in your backyard, you may have seen that coloring in the fall. So we're going to get into our next slide as we do the tree identification. And we're going to start with some common maple trees that you may have in your backyard. We're going to start with the sugar maple. So the sugar maple tree, the reason why a lot of maple farms in the Northeast tap this tree is because it has the highest sugar content of all the trees that produce sap. So the sugar content in a sugar maple typically runs about 3% on average, but based on conditions, it can be a lot higher than that. Sometimes it can be 5 or 6%. It takes 40 gallons of sap, of sugar maple sap, to make 1 gallon of syrup. So that's another reason when you go into the store and you buy real maple syrup, you're going to pay more money for that syrup because it takes more sap to make it. But this is kind of your prize tree. If you have a sugar maple in your yard, or you maybe friends with somebody that has one, this is definitely a tree you want to tap. The way you can identify them, we'll start with their leaves. So the leaves have 5 lobes. So it's the same leaf that's on the Canadian flag. The seeds on a sugar maple, I think they kind of look like chaps. So they kind of hang down. And then the bark on a sugar maple tree is going to be very rough, kind of appear kind of peely. The bud on the far right there, there's 2 little buds on each side, and then you've got the big bud right in the middle, kind of a rusty colored twig color. So those are some things to look for on the sugar maple. Again, the best time to go out and I try to identify this tree is really in the fall. Look for those orange colored, fire colored leaves. That's going to help you out. So as we go to the next slide, the silver maple. So this is a very, very common tree and that a lot of people have in their yards. The sugar content on this tree is going to range 2 to 3%. It is the earliest maple to start budding out. Therefore, it has a much shorter collection window. Once a tree starts budding out, that you're basically done collecting sap at that time. So you're collecting the sap before that happens. Silver maples are going to start budding out very early. They have 5 lobes on their leaves, but the difference between the silver maple and the sugar maple, the silver maple's lobes are very, very skinny. They also have kind of a silvery color on the underside. So in the wind, they'll kind of shimmer a little bit. And then you can see the seed on a silver maple is similar to the sugar maple, except it kind of extends out to the side a little bit more. On the far right is the bud of the silver maple. I think it looks a little bit more like globes versus what we looked at with the sugar maple. And again, I'm already seeing here at the Discovery Center, we've got some silver maples and they're already starting to get their flower on the buds. So it will not be long and they'll start budding out for the spring. The next tree we're going to talk about is the red maple. And I'm not covering all the maples tonight. I kind of picked out the ones that tend to be more common in backyards. This is a lot of people plant red maples for the color, the fall color that this tree produces. The bark on a red maple is very smooth compared to the silver and the sugar maple. It runs about 2 to 3% in sugar content, so much like the silver maple. The leaves on a red maple are kind of a tulip shape, so they don't have those the skinny lobes, like we saw with the silver maple, so kind of more compact. I think they look like a tulip. They are going to have very, very similar seed structure, just like the silver maple had. And then on the far right, there is the bud of the red maple. So a very rusty red stem. And then the bud on this one is very similar to the sugar maple. So that big center part of the bud, and then the two little parts of it on the sides. So the next one that we will talk about is the box elder. Now this tree kind of gets a bad rap. Some people don't think very highly of this tree. It sometimes grows in a ditch. It might grow in, a junkyard. It could be found in a backyard too. But it's not a tree that most people purposely plant. It kind of pops up in various areas. But the box elder tree is in the maple family. Its sugar content is lower. It's about 1% to 2%. Has a very caramely colored bark to it. If you notice box elder bugs hanging around, there's probably a box elder tree nearby. So that can be an indicator. Kind of use those bugs to maybe lead you to the tree. They have a compound leaf. So the main stem of the leaf, but then 5 leaves that are attached to that stem. The leaves can kind of look similar to the leaves of poison ivy. So it's not, you're not going to get the rash from the leaves or anything, but they do look similar. They do have a very, very similar seed, just like the other maples. And then the buds on the box elder, I think they look more like little globes. So kind of a different look, different structure than those other maples we talked about. So that is all the maple trees that I'm going to cover tonight. These next trees we're going to go through are outside of the maple family. So if we go to the next slide. All right, so many of us on this program tonight probably have a black walnut tree in your backyard or in your neighborhood. Black walnut trees are a very valuable tree in Missouri for their wood. They produce the walnuts, of course. Squirrels love those. Black walnuts will have a 1% to 2% sugar content in the sap. And the rest is water. So it's going to take a lot of sap to collect, to process down to your syrup. They have the compound leaf, so a lot of little leaflets off of that main stem of the leaf. Of course, you got the walnuts that can help you identify it. Very, very gnarly bark. With this tree, you're going to have to drill a little bit deeper into the tree. And we'll talk about where your tap is going to get placed in the tree. But the bark on a walnut tree is very thick. So that kind of sometimes can create problems. You have to just have to drill a little bit deeper. And then on the right, there is the buds. Now, black walnut trees, they are the last tree in the spring, one of the last trees to get their leaves. So with that, you've actually got kind of a longer window in the winter and early spring to leave your taps in on walnut trees before they start to bud out. So that's kind of an advantage with them. We'll talk more about the sap with walnut trees later, but this is a really good tree. A lot of people have this tree, so don't look past tapping black walnut trees. The next tree that we'll talk about is the sycamore tree. Native Americans often utilize the sycamore tree to tap to create syrup, and the reason why is because sycamores oftentimes will grow near rivers, And that was a lot of times where Native Americans were living or utilizing rivers. So this is a very interesting tree. I will admit I'm still trying to figure this tree out. I have tapped sycamore trees multiple times and have yet to collect any sap from sycamore trees. So they're kind of an interesting tree, 1 to 2% sugar content. If you are able to collect the sap and process it down to syrup, it's going to taste a lot like butterscotch. So this is a very, very interesting tree. Big leaves. The leaves on a sycamore can easily be bigger than your hand. They will produce little seed balls. Some of those seed balls, this will hang on the trees through the winter time. The buds on the right there, kind of a lime green bud. And then there's not a lot of bark to a sycamore tree, very checkered. A lot of people refer to this tree as a ghost tree because of the white color that it has, but a very beautiful tree in the wintertime against the landscape. And our next one, next slide. So this is the last tree we're going to discuss tonight. The river birch, again, this was used by Native Americans historically, has a very, very low sugar content. So 0.8% to 1.5% sugar content in the sap. So that's going to mean that you've got to collect 100 plus gallons of sap to get 1 gallon of syrup from a river birch. The other challenge with a river birch is they often grow with multiple trunks. So if you can see in that middle picture there, there's 3 trunks to the tree. The trunks are not very large. We're going to talk in just a little bit about the minimum size that you need to tap a tree. So sometimes that can come into play. You just can't find a river birch that's large enough. But if you do, definitely give them a shot. It's just going to take a lot of sap to process down to the amount of syrup. The leaf on the left there, so it's kind of a jagged edge to the leaf. And then on the right is the bud of the river birch. So a very papery type bark, kind of peely. So that's and kind of a white color. So that's a good way to identify them as well. All right, so that covers the trees. And I can't stress enough, make sure that before you do anything, go out, identify your trees, make sure you have them identified correctly and flag them. All right, so that when winter rolls around, December comes, you're going to remember where those trees are because they've lost their leaves by that time. So if you've got them flagged or marked in some way, that's going to help you out when it's time to tap them. So the next portion of the program tonight, if we go to the next slide, this is going to get into when to tap trees and how many taps you can put in a tree. So in Kansas City, we are not, and Missouri as a whole, there's getting to be a lot more people that do tap trees and are collecting the sap and processing it into syrup. But our temperatures and our weather here do not support really, really good sap collecting. What you need for really good sap flow is you need nighttime temperatures below freezing, daytime temperatures above freezing. My experience is highs in the 40s or mid 30s to 40s during the daytime, below freezing at night. And if you get consistent days where that's happening, you're going to get really, really good sap flow. We get major swings in temperatures. This week is a perfect example. Last week it was, 25 below wind chill. Today it's almost 60 degrees. So that's not conducive to really good sap flow with trees. So that kind of creates a problem with how much you can collect. On the right there is the amount of taps that you can put into a tree. So first of all, don't tap a tree that is less than 10 inches in diameter. That's your minimum. So that's going to be for one tap. So one tap goes into a tree that is diameter of 10 inches to 20 inches. You can put 2 taps into a tree that is above that diameter, like 21 inches in diameter and plus. My advice is don't get too greedy. These are trees that you want to continue to tap, in future years. You want to be thinking about the health of the tree. So, just don't get too greedy. Every time I tap trees, I just stick with one tap. And then when I'm done for the season, and I'll take that tap out, when it's time to re-tap that tree, I go a quarter of the way around the tree to a new side. So I'm never tapping in the same location year to year. That's gonna be better for the tree, less stress on the tree, and you're probably gonna get better sap collection as well. So just kind of keep those tips in mind when you do tap trees. So if we go to the next slide. So what is happening in a tree with sap flow? So during the night, all right, when the temperature is below freezing, the tree is acting like a vacuum. It's sucking up nutrients, it's sucking up water through the roots, and that is going up the trunk to the branches, to the buds. All right. During the day, when the temperature rises above freezing, pressure builds up in the tree, and all of that sap is going to look for a place to go out. So the tree has sucked everything up at night, but during the day, when it gets above freezing and pressure builds up in the tree, then that sap starts to run. And anywhere where there's a tiny hole, whether it's a woodpecker hole, a crack, or where you have put a tap into a tree, that is where the sap is going to start to ooze out. All right. So if you can get some days or a series of days where the atmospheric pressure is really low, you're going to get a much better sap run. So weather plays into a big part with sap flow. You've got to have those right temperatures. I tend to think that a tap on a tree that is placed on the warmest side of the tree where it gets a lot of sun exposure, my experience is you get a better sap flow on that side than if it's a side where it's in the shade all the time. So as far as like at night, the tree sucking up that moisture and stuff, that sap can travel up that tree pretty quickly. It's going to depend on a lot of factors, but it can be inches an hour. It can be a yard an hour. So there's a lot going on within a tree that we don't see, but it all comes down to the temperatures below freezing at night, above freezing during the day. So if we go to the next slide, there we go. All right, so we're getting into very shortly here, we're going to talk more about that tap placement. But this is a cutaway of a tree, so you can kind of see the parts of the tree. Of course, you got the bark, the outer bark. The next section of the tree is the living phloem, which is that yellow section. The green is the cambium cell layer. Then you have the sapwood, and then the inner part is called the heartwood. When you tap a tree, you want the back end of the tap to be into that sapwood. That's where the sap is flowing. So that's going to be about 1.5 to 2 inches deep into the tree. Earlier, I mentioned walnut trees. So because of their thick bark, sometimes you're going to have to go a little bit deeper into the tree, past that bark to get to that sapwood. But if you're not into that sapwood with your tap, you're not going to get the sap collected because that's where it's moving and it's flowing. So if we go to the next slide, so this will show you a tap placement. So again, the tap, also called a spile. You can see in this photo, you've got the tree bark, all right, the hole that's been drilled into that tree, and it's drilled at an upward angle. So you're utilizing gravity to help you out. And the back of that tap is into the sapwood. It's helpful too to leave just a little bit of room behind that tap or the spile, as indicated in this picture here. Kind of think of it kind of as a little collection room, all right, or a little collection void before it flows through that tap into your collection bucket. So, but generally about 1.5 to 2 inches deep when you drill into the tree at an upward angle. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. All right, so we're going to get into the equipment that you need. I am all about, there's no reason to break the bank and spend a ton of money when you're first getting started with doing this. So, of course, you're going to need a drill. You're going to need a drill bit. Match the drill bit with the size of your tap. So it's good to experiment like on a piece of wood. Make sure that your drill bit is not too big or too small because you want that tap to fit in there nice and tight so it doesn't slip out. You'll need a hammer. You're going to need a tap driver. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. You're going to need the tap or the spile. And your collection bucket. Make sure the collection bucket is food grade because you are collecting something that you're going to be consuming. So make sure it's food grade, and then make sure you have a lid. I put a little resource down there at the bottom of this slide. That is just one of several resources or companies where you can buy supplies. And I've even seen stuff now where you can buy it off of Amazon. So this buying supplies is not as hard to find as it used to be. Use whatever resource you want, whatever company. But that's kind of the general things you're going to need to get started with the tapping to collect syrup or to collect sap. I'm sorry. So if we go to the next slide. So this is going to kind of highlight what I just talked about a little bit more in detail, give you some better photos of this. So we're going to start with the tap driver in the upper left. That is basically just a piece of metal that is designed to go into the tap to help you hammer it into the tree so that you don't destroy and bend the tap. So you can see in that middle picture, that is a stainless steel tap. So the back end of that tap driver is intended to slide into that tap so that you can hammer it into the tree without any damage to it. There are lots of different taps or spouts that you can use, the stainless steel kind. There are plastic ones that have an integrated hook on them. there's multiple styles. So you just kind of have to, use what you want to use. It's best for you. I like using the stainless steel ones. They have a removable hook for the bucket, and they're very, very easy to clean at the end of the season. So with the bucket and the lid, again, I talked about that needs to be food grade. I do one additional thing with the lid. I wire the lid to the bucket. And the reason why I do that is the very first year that I tapped our trees here at the Discovery Center, had a big problem with squirrels messing with the buckets. And so they would, I would have buckets on the ground, and if you get some wind, your buckets are gone. So I would encourage you to wire the lid to the bucket. That way, if the bucket were to come off of the hook, you're not going to lose things. So that's just kind of a extra tip that I do. Lids are very important. You don't want to be collecting rain. You don't want to be collecting snow. That's going to be extra water that you've got to boil in the processing part. You're only wanting to collect the sap. So if we go to the next slide, the processing equipment for this endeavor, there's a few more things you need for the processing than you do for the actual sap collecting from the trees. So for processing, you're going to need a good filter. There are filters you can buy from companies. You can use cheesecloth. So anything that's going to, even a coffee filter could potentially work, but anything that is going to help filter out any debris, dirt, you're going to discover ants and other bugs. They love the sap as much as we do. So you've got to filter all that out before you start processing. You'll need some measuring cups. You're going to need a storage container for your nice clean sap. And again, it needs to be food grade. You can find and buy 5-gallon food grade buckets at Lowe's, Home Depot, any of those places sell them. Boiling pans. Your boiling pans need to be a large surface area. So you don't want a really deep kettle. You want something that's more shallow and a big surface area. Strainers, stir spoons, thermometers, a refractometer. I'll talk about that more in just a minute. And then finally, you're going to want some mason jars, or a syrup storage jar to put that syrup in when you're all done. So on the next slide, kind of go into a little more detail on some of these items. So again, the sap storage, those buckets are very easy to come by. Make sure you get lids with those as well. The lower left photo is that's Orlon material is what that filter is. That's a filter that you can buy from maple sugaring companies. But again, I've known people that use cheesecloth, but you're going to need a good filter so that you're capturing any debris and ending up with good quality syrup in the end. In the middle, there are a couple of examples of your processing pans. So that top one would be a pan that you would start out with. You would put your nice clean sap into that, have it over the heat, and you're boiling away the water. So you're starting at maybe 3% in your sap, and you've got to get your sap to 66% sugar. So it's a lot of water that you're boiling away. So that's why you need that shallow pan. Then when you get closer to where it's actually coming close to that 66% sugar, then you can finish it off in some smaller pots that you see there at the bottom. A refractometer measures sugar content. That is a very simple and easy instrument to use. They're very reasonable. I think they're about $20. But basically, you would put a drop of your, as you process your sap and you start getting closer to where it's, starting to look like syrup, you would put a drop of that on that blue slide. And then look through the lens on the black side of that instrument, and it will tell you if you are at the percentage of sugar that you're at. And you want to get it to 66% to be pure, syrup. Candy thermometers can also work to indicate syrup. Syrup is going to boil at 219 degrees Fahrenheit. So a candy thermometer, that's your key degree, is 219 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can definitely use that. So when we go to the next slide, so I got just a couple of slides left here. This is kind of an important one because with sap storage, so you've collected it from the tree, you brought it in, you have 7 days to process that sap, to boil it before it's going to start to spoil and ferment. So you really have to start boiling that sap soon. Now, if you have the ability to freeze it, then it's good, indefinitely. But most people do not have the freezer space for 5-gallon buckets of sap. And when you have the conditions right with collecting sap, those blue collection buckets I showed you earlier in a slide, those are 3-gallon buckets. And one of those buckets can fill with sap in 1 day when you have the best, sap flow conditions. So if you're bringing in 3 gallons of sap per day, you're going to really have to be processing to keep up with it so that it doesn't end up spoiling on you. You need to treat sap like milk with storage. It's got to be kept cold. And again, you want to start processing that sap down within 7 days so it does not start going bad on you. When does it become syrup? So 66% Brix or sugar content. That's going to be pure syrup. Candy thermometer, it will be 219 degrees Fahrenheit or 104 degrees Celsius. Syrup must be heat sealed in glass jars. So when you get done with that syrup and it's at that 66%, pour it into your glass mason jars and heat seal it with the lids on. You'll hear that lid pop. That way you'll know it's heat sealed. And once it's sealed, it'll cool down on its own, but pure syrup is not going to spoil due to that higher sugar content that it has. So you've got a long shelf life with it. I don't know why you would want to just store it on the shelf for very long because it is delicious. So you're most likely going to be putting it on pancakes or waffles or in some other way. So the next slide. We're getting close to questions here. So I wanted to show you a little DIY evaporator system. So you can boil your sap indoors, but what you have to be very mindful about is that you are boiling off a lot of water. And if you don't have some way to ventilate all that moisture outdoors, you're going to have water dripping from a lot of things inside. So you got to kind of think about that piece if you do it on the stovetop. You can use a grill. I've heard people do that outdoors. I've kind of come up with came up with this little DIY evaporator. It's not perfect, but it does the job really well. So it's basically a bunch of cinder blocks. The tall piece in the back, that is a chimney. So there is a small hole at the bottom that ventilates the smoke out. And then this is set up to where I can put 2 of those large shallow pans across the fire to be boiling down the sap. So there's other ideas out there too. If you kind of Google some DIY sap evaporators, you're going to come up with all kinds of ideas and find something that works best for you. So just kind of keep that in mind, though. It's best to do outdoors. You can do it indoors if you have a good way to ventilate the moisture. And with that, if we go to the next slide, I think it's time for questions. Got a little time left.
Let's see, Steve, we do have one question in the chat. It says, does tapping trees that produce food, like the black walnut, affect nut production?
I have not come across anything that says that it decreases the nut production of the walnut tree. I have not noticed that with the walnut trees that I tap here. So I can't I can't say that it decreases the production. Now, to kind of add to that, I didn't mention this earlier, but it's really important to look at the overall health of the tree before you tap it. So that's another thing to do in the summer and the fall. Make sure the canopy of the tree is healthy. If it's got dead branches or there's a spongy part on the trunk, don't tap that tree. Don't put extra stress on it.
That's a smart thing. How easy is it to grow sugar maples in Missouri? I always thought our climate was too hot to grow sugar maples.
They will. No, you can. They will grow. They're a tree that is. They're probably planted more, in backyards, kind of for the appeal of their fall color and stuff. Probably more so. There are some natural places in Missouri where there's a good collection of sugar maples. For example, Maple Woods Natural Area here in Kansas City, which is over by Maple Woods Community College. There is a large grove of sugar maples in there, big mature ones. So they will do well, in our conditions.
Great. Let's see. Another question in the chat. Are there steps to sealing the hole once you finish tapping for the season?
It's a very good question. You do not want to do anything to that hole when you take the tap out. The tree, I want you to kind of think of it like if you get a cut or a scrape, your body is going to start to naturally close that wound up. And that's what the tree does too. If you put something in that hole, you're kind of obstructing the tree in its natural process to heal that hole. So a healthy tree will completely close that hole shut, over the course of the growth season. So by the time you come back next winter to tap that tree again, it's going to be shut. Sometimes you can't even tell where you tapped the tree. So nope, nothing you need to do.
Oh, okay, very good. Let's see here. Does the syrup from a black walnut tree taste like black walnuts?
Yeah. So I'm glad that was asked because I wanted to talk about that. So yes, so a black walnut syrup, it's a very complex taste, and a lot of people either love it or they hate it. It does kind of have a nutty flavor to it, a little more earthy is kind of a good way to describe it. And it's also a very dark syrup compared to sugar maple, which is more of a caramely color. But I think it's absolutely delicious, just because of the complex flavors that are in it.
Cool. Let's see here. Got another question. What time of year do you tap your trees? I have read that tapping too early will end your season early. I have had a silver maple tapped for several weeks and only just started getting sap on Monday.
Yeah. So in our area here, I generally tap the trees kind of early January, but honestly, I start watching the forecast in December, because if you see, okay, mid to late December, there's highs in the 40s, lows in the 20s, and you got like 2 weeks of that coming up. I would go ahead and tap the trees, because you may have a pretty good sap run at that time. Um, you know, I it's that's the tricky part about this area, about Kansas City, because our conditions are all over the place, temperatures are all over the place, and then that impacts the sap flow. So um, it doesn't surprise me that you say that you haven't got much from the silver maples until kind of just now, because of how our winter has been, and stuff. So generally, though, to answer that question, generally early to mid January around here is when you would start tapping.
Cool.
And I will, just to add to that too, once you tap trees, no matter what happens, do not take the taps out until the end of the season. So even if you're not collecting anything from that tree, don't take it out and then re-drill another hole in that tree. Just let it be. You might be surprised in a couple of weeks it'll start flowing really good.
That's a good tip. Let's see. I don't see any other questions. If you do have final questions, be sure and throw them in the chat. I did want to let you all know that if you join this program after it started, we are recording tonight's program. So I will send out a link to the YouTube video in my email tomorrow. Okay, maybe we have one last question, maybe. How long do you typically keep your taps in?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I generally pull all of our taps here at no later than like the first part of March. Um, so end of February, first part of March, is about when our season kind of ends. Now there will be some trees, they will keep producing sap, but you got to remember, once they start budding out and you start seeing buds up in the tree, um, then it's basically going to be done. To add to that, with kind of this time of the year, with real maple syrup, the later you go into the spring with the collection of that, if you're able to, you're going to it's going to change the complexity and kind of the flavor of the syrup, because the sap kind of changes. So that's why if you go to a grocery store, you will see different grades of maple syrup. Some syrup is for consuming with pancakes and waffles. Some syrup is better for baking. So you're going to see that marked on the bottles. The good stuff for us consuming is kind of grade A. So if you notice that when you look at it. So, yep.
One last question here. Let's see, do you have any recommendations on how to talk to municipalities about letting garden guilds tap park trees?
Park trees, was that it?
Park trees, yes.
Yeah. I don't have, what I can speak to is the conservation department. We do not allow the tapping of trees on our conservation areas. So I can't speak much to park departments. My advice though is don't take a chance. Make sure, go through the proper channels. If you do want to tap a tree that's not on, your property, whether it's at a park or wherever, and see, approach them with, good knowledge and stuff. And, hopefully maybe you can get some permission. But I would also encourage folks to reach out to friends. If you know a friend that's got a couple of trees that would be worth tapping, ask them if you can tap those trees, and give them a little jar of some syrup, if they let you. So yeah, I know it's not easy when you don't have the trees, and you see them somewhere else. But yeah, so I can kind of just only speak to the conservation side on that.
Well, very good. Well, Steve, thank you so much for tonight's programs. I think we all learned something. Again, I'll send out the PowerPoint on a PDF in tomorrow's email, along with the link to the video and the evaluation form. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope everyone has a good evening.
All
See
right.
you all
Thank
next
you,
time.
everybody.